So why would states should never protect dying languages? That's what we're going to be arguing here. And what is important here, of course, is to know that languages do have value. We recognize that here in the government for communicating ideas and having both perspectives that we can compare our own languages. We don't deny this value. However, as policymakers, we always have to think what is the opportunity cost and the values of what do we get from a policy. And we have to think here that when we are protecting a dying language, like what does it require? Well, first of all, it requires translators, it requires teachers who are teaching this to kids in the schools. So it does require quite a bit of resources in general. Just think of in Sami language in the northern Finland, there are plenty of schools, plenty of resources going from the Finnish government to support and protect this language. However, there's other ways there's a way of protecting the language without putting constant resources in this protection. It's documenting the language. So we propose here, we're not saying that we shouldn't, for example, document the language as linguists and ethnographists have been doing. We are pro this, so languages should be documented so that we know what language is and get the value of it. However, we're saying that we shouldn't constantly protect the languages by keeping them alive, because this is very resource intensive. It requires constant resources into education, into teaching people and forcing people to learn this language. And we're thinking here on this side that if a language is dying, that is, there are not enough people who want to learn it and speak it, the state should not interfere in this development. Given that the language has been documented already by the scholars. Why this should not be done is because I already mentioned the opportunity cost of doing so. So all the resources that we are putting into protecting and keeping a language alive is away, for example, from the health sector. So it's resources, money away from hospitals, from the elderly care, from the child care, and we think it's more important to have the resources. So, for example, in the health sector, where the stake is a human life, and we think that this should be the prioritization of this government. And to go a little deeper on thinking like what would it mean if we would protect and keep alive a dying language, it would mean that there would be a bunch of children who are offspring of speakers of this dying language, and it would mean that these children do not want to learn naturally on their own this language, but they're rather learning the major languages. And if the government would be keeping alive this dying language, it would mean forcing the kids to learn that language. And we think it's a matter of individual freedom as well. So we wouldn't be forcing the kids to learn the language in order to preserve it. So it is a matter of individual freedom. It's also a matter of individual benefits. So thinking of these children who we would need to force to learn the dying language, it would mean that they would have a language which is absolutely no value in the marketplace. So it would not help them to, realistically speaking, it would not help them to get a job in the future, for example. Of course, it might help them to learn other languages afterwards, but we think this is a matter of prioritization in that if the kids want to learn, for example, that some major languages, we shouldn't be forcing them to learn a dying language. This would be detrimental to the children's benefit in the future too. And to go a little further, yeah, at this point, if there are any POYs, I can take them. So in case you do have any POYs, I'm happy to take them at this stage. If not, then I would like to emphasize that, yeah, perhaps I've already said everything that I have said. Yeah. Let me just look for the notes for a while. See if there's anything to add to this case. Yes. Well, it looks like this is it. So I thank you very much for listening, and yeah, looking forward to the next speaker. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much. Woo! Well, it's okay to clap. I mean, we can't knock on the table, but at least I find that it's a nice gesture. So I'd like to thank the speaker very much. On the opening opposition, who's speaking first? Just so I would know to refer to you and to give you feedback with your own name. So who's first on opening opposition? You're still on mute. Opening opposition. Anna and Jan or Jan? Going once, going twice. Sold. Okay, guys, is everything okay?
So I can start?
Yes.
Okay, so we believe that every language contains unique information that is important to be preserved. I will have 3 points in this speech. I will start with saying what this unique information is. Then I will explain why it's important to preserve it. And in my third point, I will compare the world with and without these languages. Before that, I would like to start with a few points of rebuttals. Government tells us that keeping a language alive keeps up too much resources. We believe that it worth these resources, and there are people who would be happy to participate it even without getting paid for it, and I will explain you in my speech why I think so. Furthermore, they tell us that they would just document the languages and then let them die. Now, we think that this is not possible. A living language is changing and evolving, and because of that, it's not possible to document. A documentation of a language is not the same as letting a language survive. For example, how would you document English language? Would you document by Shakespeare, or would you document it by tweets from Trump? It's a completely different language, and you can't possibly document every option in a language. Furthermore, we believe that the documentation itself would require high resources as well. Furthermore, they tell us that they wouldn't force kids to learn these languages because it interferes with freedom of choice. We think that it has very many benefits for the kids, and we wouldn't call it forcing. We are also forcing kids to learn English in school because it's vital for their survival later. I think learning the languages of their culture is the same. So to my first point, why every language contains unique information. I think you all had the experience that you wanted to say something which you have in your mother tongue, but it doesn't exist in English. For example, in my mother language, Hungarian, if someone is very hungry, they say he's hungry as a wolf. In German, you would say hungry as a bear, and in English, you would say hungry as a lion. And it all has a unique information contained in it corresponding to the culture of connected to the language. So in my first point, I will tell you what the knowledge unique to every language can be. First of all, it can be a historical information, an information about the tribe and the nation that can't be expressed in any other language. It's heredited by parents to the kids, and if the language gets lost, this information gets lost as well. There's a unique information connected to the culture, for example, the name of a craft method that only this tribe in the entire world knows. And most importantly, that there can be unique information, for example, about healing power of a plant that grows at a place where this tribe lives. Traditional medicine has a huge potential because currently there are millions of species with unknown medical potential. And there are tribes that use these plants at their place for many, many years. And they have this unique knowledge with huge medical potential that would be lost if we lose these languages. So to my second point, why is it important to keep these languages alive? I think that a very unique characteristic of 21st century human is that we like to collect data and understand and learn the world through data. We can deal with huge amount of data, and we can process this data and update this data as the language develops and survives and thrives, to understand more about world history and local history and implement this knowledge to get more information about the political value and economical value, about the cultural value of a unique language that can attract tourists, for example, to this place. And my partner will explain you the cultural value of these languages further. And it has the unique value connected to medicine, which can save lives. One of the most used cancer drugs coming from a plant in Australia that the local tribe used for many, many years. And someone went there to investigate this tribe and found out, well, yes, besides having a unique language, they have a cure for cancer that no one knew before. And if the language is lost, this information would be lost as well. So to my third point about how the world preserving this language and without preserving these languages compared to each other. In the 21st century, being multilingual is very common. English is becoming the most widespread language and basically everyone speaks it. Being bilingual is very, very common. For example, kids in certain parts of Spain learn Spanish and Catalan during their childhood. They learn one of it at home, they learn the other in the school, and they have no problem speaking both languages and being fluent in both languages. And this is common to many other countries in the world. Yes, I will take you.
There is a clear difference between what are dying or languages going extinct and minority languages existing within societies. What are you talking about?
So I think what I'm saying is keeping a language alive, letting people speak it and allowing people to speak it and also trying to encourage people to use this language so that it will be kept alive and develops, and also the people who know this language know the information underlying the language. So back to my point, we think that now it's very common to know many languages, and this would allow these people to have a knowledge implementing both local traditions and their own traditions and their family's traditions, which can be important for them, for their self-definition, while by knowing English or knowing a more common language in the country, also having the global knowledge and a tool to communicate with anyone that they meet. I think parents and grandparents are happy to give this knowledge forward because it's an important thing for them. It's important for their life, and it's important for them that their kids also get this knowledge that they got from their parents. I don't think that it's a problem. We have schools, we have internet, kids can learn 2-3 languages very, very easily. And we think that people who actually know many languages have a better understanding of the world. They have more flexibility to interact with different people. And they have this unique characteristic, knowing a language, which is unique and special, and it can make someone special the same as having a unique hobby. And furthermore, it would allow them to learn languages faster. So my bottom line is that we believe that in our world, we prevent the loss of information through conserving these languages, and we would not have any loss of global communication. So yeah, because of that, please oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Woo!
This is fine?
Yes.
One, two, three, go. So the question in this case, especially when we are talking about dying languages, it tends to be that these languages are rejected by the speakers who speak them. So young individuals saying, okay, I no longer desire to speak this sort of a language. I would rather integrate myself into the global community or whatever the majority language in the environment is. And thus, when these individuals say, okay, let's preserve these sort of languages, they are going against these individuals' wishes to reject this language and desire to incorporate this sort of a new language. And they don't really talk about how they actually preserve this sort of a language in this sort of an environment where people are actively rejecting this sort of a thing that they have. Now, let's have a few lines of rebuttal. Now, they talk about how languages include important information and how we should preserve this and how data can be collected through this. Okay, but we have to ask, in this current environment, especially where this in these, let's say, more Western countries, and that's where this has been this sort of a focus on respecting the minority cultures and seeing sort of value that these cultures are being, that the value that these cultures provide, then it is unlikely that this language would be abandoned, especially when there's this sort of a strong research incentive, especially when they see that this language is sort of a thing that provides information, whereas languages that are dying are clearly being selected against, and it seems that they do not provide this sort of an information, especially by individuals that belong into this language. So it seems that the process by which a language becomes dying negates a lot of the benefits that opposition provides us. Let's go a bit deeper into why it is actually quite expensive to teach these sort of dying languages, especially when the people are actively rejecting the language. Well, you need to have obviously motivated translators in order for you to change meaning from the original language to the other. It's not just pure syntax. There's also semantic meanings that need to be studied a long time. And how do you get these sort of motivated individuals for a language that is dying? Thus, there isn't much incentives to study this sort of a language because it doesn't provide these sort of benefits the individuals have. And thus, you would have to incentivize individuals for them to be ordered to study this sort of a language. And thus, money would be moved from one place to the other in a, let's say, less optimal manner because you have to incentivize this sort of a behavior. And thus, when we talk about, let's say, the opportunity cost of the individuals that have to sort of learn it, because obviously when they are rejecting it, you have to force it upon these sort of individuals in order for them to learn it. And what could actually happen in this sort of case, they might start rejecting it because they despise the fact that you are now forcing this sort of old culture that they might not even feel is their own anymore. And thus they might be more incentivized to reject their own language anymore because now they feel that this is being forced upon themselves by the state, a decision that we have ourselves rejected, the minority populations or whatever the minority language is, has themselves rejected or seen that it is no longer useful, as they said before. And thus they are forcing it upon them to make the decision that they do not want themselves. So they sort of give this perspective, oh, they have the minorities and this sort of value. But when the individuals that actually speak the language reject it, then it sort of asks a question of where does the value actually come from when they reject this sort of a language? And when we talk about, let's say, sustaining the language as it is, well, we believe that the cultural environment and the individuals who speak it have the responsibility for themselves to sort of market this sort of language, sort of demonstrate the value that this sort of language has, because obviously if it is dying, it is being selected against, and it tends to be selected against by the population which speaks the language and the population that makes the decision whether to sustain this language or not. And sure, they might talk about like how new meaning is born to the use of language, but obviously when it is dying already and less and less speakers are speaking it, making a conscious choice not to speak it, then clearly the amount of new meaning being generated is clearly being reduced by the fact that the language is being abandoned, because less speakers implies less new meaning generation because less people speak it. And that's the sort of value of continuously sustaining a language which is being rejected by the individuals who speak it and whose sort of meaning generating mechanism has been slowed down to a halt due to the fact that they reject the language. Then it doesn't seem like the documentation thing, if we even do it, because when the language is dying, it might not even be valuable anymore. Then it is not clear how we are preserving something that is so valuable as the opposition has stated. Then they talk about the value of multilinguality. Well, we obviously do not deny this, but usually the value of a multilingual individual, or the value that the multilinguality generates for this individual, tends to be a function of this language actually being spoken by a lot of individuals. And obviously, if the language is dying, it seems that a lot of people are rejecting it. And if the individual wants to sustain it, well, it's upon the individual to make this sort of a decision, and it is not upon the state to sort of sustain this sort of an identity for the individual, especially when this identity is being rejected by the other members of the community. So it doesn't seem like the state should sort of preserve this for these few specific individuals that decide not to reject this sort of an identity, because clearly their community has perhaps made a choice, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps from convenience, to reject this sort of a language. And this is the process by which the dying language, or the process by which a language becomes dying, and thus the process themselves sort of demonstrate why it no longer has the value that the opening opposition seems to purport that the language has. So the basic case of the government is that there are a lot of opportunity costs related to teaching this sort of language, and how it is hard to find individuals that are motivated to translate between the majority and minority languages. We also or the dying language, and we also demonstrated the fact that if the language is already dying, then a lot of the benefits described by the opposition actually are unlikely to be there, and thus a lot of the benefits that they describe just don't happen to be in existence. Thus, we are proud to propose.
Woo. I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the deputy leader of the opposition. Woo.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So just give me a second. Okay, so I'm starting my timer now. So in my speech, I would like to follow what my partner said and give thanks to what she said. Examples, and then I would go more into why it's important regarding tradition to keep the languages alive, why languages shapes humanity and people, and if we lose this language, then we will lose a lot of what we know about humans and what we know in general, and how it affects culture, folk, poetry, songs, and so on. But before, I would like to give some rebuttal. So first, the motion says never protect. So we might not be able to protect every single language, but we are trying to save or encourage some not to be extinct, becoming extinct. Also, we are not forcing people, but we are helping to protect the language. Okay, this is very important, because what the government says is that we are forcing people to teach the kids the language, and then the kids to learn the language, and thus blah blah blah. We are not forcing them, so this doesn't stand. Also, regarding the multilinguality and the point that it wouldn't help them in the market, I strongly disagree, and I agree that bilinguality isn't unique by itself, but let me give you some relevant examples to why exactly in this specific world we are getting a lot. One of them is, for example, during the Second World War, American Army used Native Americans and Native Indians to use their language as a cryptography, basically. No one was able to break this code because no one understood the language, because there were no books, nothing written. Just the people who spoke it could receive and send the messages. We would lose this. Second, tourism. For example, there's many places where the local guides need to speak the language of the world, for example, English or French, German, and they also need to know the local culture and they need to know the local language. Those people who were being raised in this specific culture with a specific language are extremely valuable for the tourism. They are valuable as translators, as book writers, as tourist guides. Last but not least, science. There has been many dead languages which had been documented, but it's not of any use because we are not able to read it. Let me give you one example. For example, the Hittite language was deciphered at the end, but only because we had one piece of this, which was written in 3 different languages, and just somehow we were able to recover this language. But even if the language is perfectly documented in another language which we don't know, it's totally useless. We are losing the value. So documenting doesn't also help us. So let me go to the first point which I have. So language shapes humanity and people. As was mentioned by my colleague, there are unique expressions in every language which are based on the past of the whole society, which represent the whole culture, which represent the nature where the people live, and also, for example, let me give you another example. There are languages where you don't have certain expressions because they don't appear, or you have languages where the people use God's name or religion a lot, and then this is like transmitted to the language. And in German you have, for example, go with your with God's blessing. You can have the same in English, but people don't use it, and you can use those tiny bits of information to track how people behave, how people are, what is important for them, because if it's important, they will have a word for it. If you look at this, then you can, for example, look at the whole population. How does it behave? Are they more aggressive? Are they more calm? What if we change the language? Often the language comes with the thoughts, and often it comes with the emotions. Through language, we are able to express ourselves, and through language, we are also able to change ourselves. So if we understand what's in the language, then we are able to manipulate us and other people. That brings me to another part, which is the wisdom, the folk, and the traditions. For example, when I was a kid, my mom sang baby songs to me. Before I fell asleep, she always said and sang me songs before until I until I got to sleep. I would like to understand, for example, when I got older, I learned and I understood what she was singing to me. It's very important for me to understand this piece of knowledge to connect to my ancestors. And I wouldn't have the chance if there was no one supporting the language, if the language just died and my mom was the only one who knew it, and I wouldn't be able to pick up the language before before she passed away, for example, there wouldn't be anyone, and this piece of thing would be missing inside me. Also, very often what we see in languages, people are named, people have names, and the names have a meaning. Those meanings are also something which many people believe has something to do with the personality, with their fortune in the life, and so on. In English, we don't see it anymore. For example, there is no meaning of Ben in English, but in Hebrew, Ben means a son. So suddenly, the people are, and Hebrew was a dead language. So basically that recovered. So those people would just have a name and no idea what it is. those names are not only for people, but also for the scenery. In Native Americans, they named the places based on how the places looks like, what they behave, and using this information, scientists were able to understand that there are some parts there are hidden volcanoes or hidden holes, because what they were saying in their language was exactly describing what is happening in the nature. If we don't have this, if we don't preserve, if we don't try to protect the languages, we are losing all those tiny informations. And as I tried to tell you, it's hidden in songs, poems, sayings, in our everyday daily life as our names. With that, please oppose.
Woo! I would like to thank the speaker and call upon the member of government. Woo!
Sorry, can I do something here too? Or can you already hear me? Is it fine?
Yes, now it seems to work.
Everything is working, cool. All right, ready?
Yes.
So I'm going to do in my speech 3 things. I'm going to start with some rebuttals, and then I'm going to extend by specifically talking about the benefits that we have of focusing on a major language. This was touched upon opening government, but nearly no analysis was given, and I think that this is a really crucial link in this debate. Furthermore, I'm going to a bit extend on the alternatives, and something that opening government gave some alternatives, but I'm going to show some other possibilities of alternatives that I think that also are a crucial fact here in this debate. But firstly, please let me do some rebuttals on the biggest points that they have said so far by opening opposition. So what we got there is this idea of like unique information, like plants, healing powers of flowers, etc. Please notice that these are quite fringe benefits, the unique information, right? If you compare with, for example, modern healthcare, we probably don't want these tribes going and eating plants if they can get vaccinated, for example, right? I mean, there is some kind of like, I understand what they're saying, but still, like, modern healthcare is very strong, and we want them to actually integrate to society and to get really good benefits of like using chloride in their water, of using like modern healthcare and these kinds of things. We want them to integrate. It's safer for them and it's more effective than going with traditions in most majority of cases. Secondly, the bilinguality. Here we have to do a really crucial difference between small and larger languages. We're talking about dying languages. We're not talking here about like minority languages. Now, if you talk about like Spanish Catalan, that's not what we're talking about. Catalan is a really strong and big language and is going to survive. Furthermore, and as they also like taking in this idea of language shapes people, notice that many of these like speaking habits are still going to be, I mean, your mother is more than welcome to sing the songs that she wants for you in the future as well. This is not something that we're limiting. We're talking about teaching these languages in school, keeping like really large media coverage for these people, giving governmental services, giving signposts, and these things are crucially cost a lot of money. And now, we're not talking about singing to your kids. That is more than allowed, even in our side of the world. And we actually think that that's a really good way to keeping tradition alive. Now, what we have to notice here then is that most of their benefits that they're trying to push out are kind of like these quite fringe benefits. I mean, they exist, but they're quite small, and they're quite in some particular cases, and it's not even clear in all cases that's actually going to benefit this small society, as in the healthcare system, right? In many cases, it might actually backfire. So where do we actually come in here with the biggest and first point that I want to bring out here? What's the benefit of focusing on major language? Also, like pave the way by opening government. What we're talking about here is that we are going to teach the majority language to these kind of like communities that are outside. We're going to give these kids the full benefit of having the majority language, be it like Finnish in Same, which Finnish also is a quite small language, but still, or like English in United States for everyone, even the smaller Alaskan tribes, right? So what are the benefits for kids and for the youth and to future adults in this situation? Let's go there with some at least 4-point analysis here. So first, better for job prospects, right? So this idea here comes from multiple places. So how do people feel like when they have someone who speaks natively their own language? Now, this was also talked about in opening government, the importance of your native language, of knowing the difference between a wolf share or a lion's share or whatever. Now, this is something that makes people feel that they're more integrated, more closely connected to the person, and thus increasing your job prospects directly. When you go to a job interview and you're able to communicate in a way that directly links with the person that is interviewing you, your job prospects increase hugely. Also, you get this kind of like better vocabulary to separate nuances. What we're talking here is that this is the biggest difference that we're giving here, right? So please pay attention. We are giving native language abilities to these more offshore communities, to these communities that are really not the major languages in the place. We're giving them the ability to speak like natives in the future. There might be one generation gap, but in the second generation, definitely they're going to be like native speakers, because they're going to go through the whole schooling system in the majority language, right? So they're going to be able to better separate nuances. They are going to have better vocabulary, more mobility, so they can actually easily, or more easier than nowadays, move to another location and try to find some jobs, right? So this all gives, for the first part of my my analysis, on better job prospects. Secondly, it's better for education. Why? Well, notice how nowadays most learning happens through, for example, the internet. So if you are focusing on a majority language, you actually learn how to read faster and more efficiently, even books, internet, and all kinds of things, and keep kind of like get faster this kind of like learning abilities through having more nuance and knowing better vocabulary, etc. Right? Secondly, children from all these societies and communities are not pressured to kind of like learn this language, so they can freely just go around and learn the language that they like, the majority language that they often wish to, or not if they don't want to, right? So then third part of the analysis, better for politics. What do I mean with this? Politics often comes really nuanced with kind of like with nuances that you need to be able to discuss and these kinds of things. And this is what you learn when you are a native speaker. This means that you will better be able to defend your own tribe in political discussions and be more active citizen. Furthermore, like a quite small one, but just like to show the vast majority of the benefits that you can see here, it's like even to find a partner. You have a bigger pool from partners that you can find when you speak a language more efficiently. It's like the amount of benefits are huge when you speak the majority of the language. Secondly, what I want to bring here is the alternative, right? So what I'm talking about here is like, instead of spending on healthcare, etc., as opening government, we can also use this money and spend on integration. And this is really crucial. Why? Well, in most cases, like providing these teachers, etc., they're really expensive, as was said by opening government. But most people, often in these countries, they want to have really stable jobs. They want to move out from these kind of like smaller places to have a place with more job security, more city services, etc. And they cannot do it without really large housing aids, locations, and school subsidies, work subsidies, which we can actually use to help them to integrate to society and bring them to somewhere which is much safer, much better to live after we have this money available that we don't use through this integration. All right, thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the member of the opposition. Woo.
One second, I'm gonna start my timer. Can you all hear me very well?
No, it sounds a bit robotic. Can you repeat?
Can you hear me?
Sounds better.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to keep this microphone down close. Okay, so before I start with my speech today as member of opposition, I would like to ask some questions that we believe on closing up were kind of missed in the top half, and we would like to discuss them a bit furthermore, and in their light, we will go on to our arguments. The first question is, let's clarify what a language is. So language consists of vocabulary, it consists of gestures, tones, intonation, proverbs, or anything that is used for communication between two people or more. Now, what is a dying language? As has been mentioned, it was actually mentioned by government. A dying language is a language that is no longer spoken. Few individuals can still speak a language, however, it will still be dead if it's not spoken on a bigger scale. And thirdly, we're going to discuss how does a language die. So this is something that's an important question that has been missed in this debate. So a language dies usually when it is no longer used, no longer taught, it is no longer the official language in documentation or in daily life communication. And we find that a lot of these factors are actually caused by the state. So if it's no longer used in schools, if it is no longer used by in official documentation or in official communication, then that is the responsibility of the state. And a lot of other things, we believe that this point is especially important because we think that a lot of times people who forget their languages only get carried away by their environment, and they do not intentionally decide and make a conscious choice of letting go of their language. That we believe responds to their motivation and individual motivation. A lot of people do want to continue knowing and speaking their languages. However, the environment around them does not facilitate that. And that leads us to the fourth question, which is how does it look like for a state to protect certain language? So one, it lists it as an official language so it can be used officially. Two, it facilitates learning it by having curricula that teaches it to nation citizens, not only for people who care about a certain language, but it should be considered officially as a country, as a nation's heritage, and it should be taught to everybody. So this is important. And thirdly, it encourages production in said language. So it would encourage its production in TV shows, in books, in children's stories, etc. So a dying language, we believe, is a result of state negligence or its interest in forming a generic identity where people of a nation state have all of their differences erased in a shallow representation of what the state should look like. So having clarified all of those, I would like to go to my rebuttals. 2 or 3 points I would like to reply to. First of all, we heard that integration is better and should be like put above anything else when it comes to learning that language. Well, we believe on opposition side, on closing up, that embracing our uniqueness and learning from each other is much more beneficial than integration. What do you gain if there are no differences between you and your people? Like, what do you gain if you can no longer have constructive conversations in order for you to teach each other and learn from each other? We believe that this is much more beneficial than having a very similar identity in this country. And language is very much tied to identity. Language is a huge part of identity. Before I go on to my second rebuttal, I will take from government whip. Sorry.
So what do you have to mention about the places in which you are discriminated based on the language or the accent you have, and why it is harder for you to find employability if you don't speak the major language?
The problem here is discrimination. It is not the existence of the language. You see, a language is very important to you. If I personally had a choice between forgetting my mother tongue and being able to better integrate, I would definitely choose to maintain my heritage because it's very important to me. This is something that I will discuss further in my speech. But going on to with my rebuttals, it has been mentioned that benefits of teaching from both opening and closing opposition, that benefits of teaching the common language it's that it makes you feel more integrated, better job prospects, different vocabularies, giving the chance to minorities to speak like natives, etc. Well, here's the tricky part. Well, being bilingual is possible, as we have heard from our opening team, and as we have clarified. So protecting a language does not mean that it is the only one we will ever speak. We will still get to interact with people who speak other languages, and that's completely fine. We can be perfectly proficient in more than one language, and we will still have the same opportunities. But in fact, we will have more opportunities if we still speak our mother tongue instead of letting it die. And that also replies to the point of that it's better for politics. As we said, you can still be proficient in more than one language, like the common language that people speak and your own language. We don't see that as a problem whatsoever. I will go to my arguments. Well, my main argument here is that most languages, I mean, we're talking about modern times, we're talking about modern nation states. Modern languages being forgotten and lost in modern states are a direct result of colonization and oppression to indigenous people. So a lot of this was intentional when people were colonized, when, for example, like America was colonized, when, for example, Australia was colonized. It is a direct effort from those colonizers to help to erase the identity of the land that has existed before colonization, in order for them to create a new identity for the land that they're trying to form or like make official. We believe that a lot of it's a result of negligence, but nowadays we have our awareness, we have our knowledge, we realize how important it is to maintain cultures and not have them gone and erased. Because as we see right now, like a lot of things that, for example, people in ancient Egypt knew, we don't have access to, because so few people know the language, and so few people know how to decipher. And a lot of people, actually, there are a lot of scriptures that we don't know anything about, because we have lost so much ancient knowledge. So we believe it's a state's responsibility to like make up for what it did in the past, at least to try to protect the indigenous heritage. And okay, my time's up. Okay, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the government whip. Woo.
Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Just give me a second. I'll just take my timer out. Okay, 3, 2, 1, start. Chair, we see that there's a debate that's evolving in the closing half of the debate that did not happen in the opening half. So as the government whip, my job is to firstly summarize what happened in the opening half, what was clearly missed out, and what we clearly bring from closing government, and how we also tackle whatever the points closing opposition brings about, right? So let's first talk about the broad clashes that happen in this debate. Is firstly, what are the requirements to protect these languages, and what are the kind of like trade-offs that you have? The second is what is the culpability of the state, right? And this is something which is, I think, uniquely brought by like closing opposition, which we also want to discuss. And the third and the major point that ties all these arguments together is the difference between what are dying languages and what are minority languages, right? So before I go into explaining what opening half missed out on, I need to tackle what closing opposition brings in, right? Closing opposition brings in the idea of like the colonial imposition of like English, French, or other languages on like the people in a nation, and what the state does in like destroying these kind of like local languages, right? Here is where the clear distinction has to be made from the POIs. I've been constantly asking the opposition bench, is there's a difference between what are dying languages and what are minority languages is, right? So in their own explanation from closing opposition, they mentioned that the dying language is a group of people who are not speaking the language as much as before, and the communities are usually small. Minority languages, as in many places, have a different status, and they already are having like the requirements that they want, right? To give the example from opening opposition, in the US, Spanish is not a dying language, but a minority language because it's not spoken by the majority of people. But Navajo, which is like the American Indian language in World War II, is a dying language with a very small amount of population, right? So the problem for op side, and especially closing opposition in their argumentation, is to give the benefit of what it means to protect a very small and minority, like not a minority, but like a dying language or something which is endangered, compared to something that already has benefits, right? And this makes more sense, especially when it comes from their argumentation of like what is the state's culpability in all of these, right? They say that, okay, whatever historical reasons are there, that's why you're losing out on your local cultural requirements. And this is where we clearly say that this is false, right? Like, yes, you have the ability to talk about not learning your mother language, like your mother tongue or like the language which you're like coming from, just because you have the privilege to be here and debate in English, right? And that's the problem, is that in the globalized society, no matter how much the benefits are there of learning multiple languages, not having a lingua franca like German, English, or French is something that hurts you in the workforce or hurts you throughout the thing, right? I can clearly speak from experience because like in India, you're forced to learn English over regional languages, which are not dying, but that's a completely different debate. What is the debate about? This is a debate about languages which are in small tribal communities, which don't have much ability to like help themselves out, right? And this is where the problem is, like the money you spend on them is not worth it, right? It's the money that the state is using to provide services like the kind of translation things that opening government talks about, or the things that like closing opposition brings in, right? Like the kind of media coverage, the kind of requirement of making shows, because the community they themselves describe small, the benefits they bring are then equally small. There's not going to be huge market for these people to have like newspapers in their own languages or like TV shows in their own languages, hence it's smaller, right? So the only benefit that they kind of then bring is the same thing that opening government brings about. Opening opposition brings about is a kind of like uniqueness of cultural identity which happens to be tied in with language, right? This is where we clearly say there is a difference between what is preservation and what is protection, right? Like, yes, you would still have the ability to like speak your language, to talk with your like parents, to like gain your knowledge from your grandmother, but it does not mean that I will make sure that in the community that you have to go to a school which is going to teach that language as a primary mode of instruction. That doesn't mean that I'm going to pigeonhole you into this kind of requirement of like culturally obligated to preserve this language, right? This is what like opening government talks about, but misses the link which we bring clearly to you, right? There's a difference between like having the choice to go and take up the language after you learn English and being brought up in this kind of medium where you have to learn the local language, and then you're restricted in the opportunities that you have to take up a job in that local domain or take up a job in some very fringe opportunity, which is not allowing you to then choose like the globalized society, right? Being bilingual is a privilege in society which allows you to like interact with other people in like in the globalized world, but it is very different to when as a state you are like protecting as many languages as you can, right? This is when we feel that the benefits for these small communities which they describe is much better, which we bring are the alternatives of using this money to integrate them into society, right? We take the burden that the state is culpable in whatever historical like problems happen, but it's much better to integrate them and give them better means of earning themselves and have the ability to learn English or some major language to then debate on the political platform about the individuality of their culture, right? Because the problem is when you are someone who's left outside and like isolated from the rest of the world, it's much easier for them to not care about you and go for. That's why most of these like Native American societies after like colonization by the like in the US had to come up in their own platform to talk, to get reservations and other things. Like this is where keeping them isolated is something which is not going to help them. And before that happens, I'll take one from opening opposition.
Yes. Why do you think the government tries to protect species from going extinct and historical artifacts from getting lost, even if it costs a lot of money?
Okay, here's the difference, right? There's a difference between what are like endangered species and maybe like species which are just small in your country, right? We say that even in these factors, there's a difference between what the community of scientific people provide to like protect languages versus what is done by the state to have these protections, right? The state needs to put up signboards, the state needs to print newspapers, the state needs to like subsidize TV shows, the state needs to like give a lot more money than just the linguistic society taking a grant from maybe Bill Gates to like preserve like the Navajo language, which is spoken by 5 people, right? We're not saying that you shouldn't like preserve these languages or document them as what opening government is trying to say, but we talk about the harms of trying to protect them and trying to take this kind of like historical culpability that CO brings into forcing these people to self-isolate more and restricting their ability to like expand in society, and also at the same time making sure that these people don't have the means to actually bring about their cultural uniqueness, right? All other benefits that they bring about of like medicinal requirements and all of the things are highly fringe and also very small compared to the societies that they're trying to do. And the benefits that we bring from specifically closing government in extension to what opening government brings is much larger, right? We told you the harms of what happens when you try to take this kind of state for money and spend it on these things. And also being bilingual is not something which is free, right? I have a cost of learning English versus Tamil, which is my mother tongue, even if it is not a dying language. So it does not mean that when I'm in my society learning this kind of dying language that I have equal opportunity to learn English to the same degree. It might be discrimination in society, but that is what limits my resources and my ability to self-actualize in society. For all these reasons, please vote closing government.
Woo! I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the opposition whip. Woo!
Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, so I would like to thank everyone for this spectacular speech, spectacular debate, and it has been an interesting debate so far. And I would like to wrap it all so nicely. So what's happening in this debate is we're actually debating between the individual freedom of actually protecting its right in representing its culture through the language, and between the responsibility of the state to protect these dying languages. It's between the heritage and the traditions, and between the benefits that the government has been debating on. But there's this tricky way that the government keeps on printing us or giving us this image that protecting other dying languages would somehow affect the major language, and this is all kind of mistaked and misunderstood, which was actually defended by the closing up. And this is why I'm standing here to tell you that the protection of other dying languages wouldn't be affecting the major language. And this is all the benefits that has been given by the opening government, and the opening and the closing government somehow aren't neglected. All of them are valid, but you aren't giving me any solid burdens that would be brought if actually the state gave more attention and gave more effort in protecting that. All the job opportunities and all the economical helps and all of these stuff, the crucial profits that have been brought by the opening government and the closing government would still be valid if the state is protecting these dying languages. And here's the thing, no burdens were brought in protecting the languages, but we brought extra benefits by protecting these dying languages. And that's what happened. In starting with the opening government, they actually focused on 2 points. The first one is that it's enforced on the people, but they forgot the fact that they did not have any choice of having their language dying, because they've lost it as the result of colonization, they've lost it as a result of globalization, they've lost it, and they forgot the fact that it might not be their own thing. I might be the one of people in the Amazon people in Morocco, in Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, and all of these people, that's actually 8.5 million people, and still considered a dying language. And here's the fact, they did not choose to have their language dead, which actually really intimate to their culture. So they did not choose that. Just let me 1 second, I'll take from the government. Okay, so that's the thing that actually clashes exactly with the point that was given by the government, that it's their responsibility, which somehow cancels what you said about being enforced, because it wouldn't be enforced as we're just asking from the state to protect us, as it has a more effective way in helping these dying languages from going extinct. And I'll take from member of government. Yeah, go ahead.
So you said that speaking something as your own native language doesn't make much of a difference, but at the same time, you're saying that it's so important for you to be able to speak your own native language when it's actually the infringe or this like small language. Please, this is a contradiction. Please choose which one. Is it important or not?
Yeah, it's not a contradiction. As I'm saying, it's not affecting the major language that you're trying to tell me, that it's really important for the state to focus on the major language instead of helping that. But you're not telling me what difference it would bring if it helped the states. And this is what the motion is about. It's about protecting dying languages. It's not talking about replacing all the major languages with all of these dying languages. You're trying to state what burden would be brought if the state was protecting it, because it will not be affecting the major language that's actually going in the states. And for that, I'm going to emphasize all the most important points that was brought up as the opening, the closing opposition, is that as a result of colonization and as a result of all of what's happening, we're now debating in English. We are not debating in any other language. And that's why the indigenous heritage, the traditions, the history, and all of these things are thrown apart just because of the colonization came upon us and gave us their language and forced us to actually start talking with language and having all of our culture, all of our traditions, and all of the things mixed with this language. Because I'm 21 years old and I've never had anyone teaching me English if it wasn't a foreigner, because they've always told us the culture has an intimate relation with the one who's speaking it. And that's why when you have this language dead, when you have it all set apart, who's going to give you and bring you actually the flavor of this culture that's trying to throw me apart? You keep on trying to say that there is no actual importance of bringing this culture, but yet again, you're not stating any harm or burden that would be brought, because all the benefits that focusing about the major language would still be brought by protecting the dying language. And for a point for the opening government that I would like to know is that you said that it died because it had no quite enough knowledge, it didn't have quite enough things. But what about the hieroglyphic on the Asian the hieroglyphs in Egypt, the importance of understanding the ancient history of Egypt? How do you understand that? What about Latin? What about Hebrew? When the members stated that how Hebrew was about to be a dead language and it was brought again, so we now can understand the Bible. We don't understand it without the Latin. We don't understand that without the language. So the importance of this, you might have it in some aspects not that important from your perspective, and I really appreciate that and respect it, but in other places you still need it to be represented by through the language. So as a result of the neglectance of the state, we have all of these dead languages going apart. So we're now giving you a mechanism as the closing opposition to how to bring it up back again, and that was not given in any other speech, is that facilitating teaching it and viewing the importance of it, viewing the importance of the culture created to it, and for that I'm proud to oppose. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone. If you can give me, I don't think it should take more than 2 minutes. I don't mind if you speak to each other. In the meantime, I'll just mute myself. Feedback. So I will start with a bit of general comments that don't necessarily reflect the ranking, but I think would help you in future debates, and then the ranking rationale behind it, and a bit of personal feedback for everyone. So the first thing that I'd like to mention as more of a general comment is that I think that sometimes speakers and teams ran away a bit from the specific motion in the sense of focusing more on dying languages, unlike other languages that people speak that may not be the lingua franca. And I think there needed to be more emphasis on those languages, in the context in which the language is spoken, who speaks it, how, and so on. So do you think that this is something that can be passed on, or is it something that people want to learn, don't want to learn, why, and so on, and then try to build more realistically around the features of that specific language? Then, moreover, on what then would be the result of the state trying to intervene when it comes to that language? So what kind of resources would you have to implement? Would it be successful in actually doing that because of motivations, because of resources, because of many different factors to put into this? And then what would be the cost of doing that, considering what we're talking about? And here, I think this also leads to the fact that sometimes people were pretty quick to jump into different impacts of either having the main language or having a minority dying language, but not necessarily on why this translates into we need the motion in order to get the benefits. So for example, on government, there was the claim of a certain mutual exclusivity between the main language and the dying language, but there had to be more on the link between why then the preservation of the dying language is the fact that creates the mutual exclusivity, meaning the tying of the motion much more to that claim. Or on opposition, there were a lot of claims about the unique cultural value of dying languages, but not necessarily enough on why then the government has to be the agent that reinforces that or helps that come into being or makes it more accessible to people via its actions. So here, I think, try and think more about what does the actual policy do in relation to those specific dying languages that we're doing, and then tie everything that you say much more to that. And I think then it helps you be much more focused on, okay, we can agree on certain normative values, but the question is, what should government do? Why should it do it? And so on. So I think these are two major things to take into consideration. Another thing is, I think some teams do contextualize much more, but I think it would have helped the debate if it were clear, even from the beginning, what kind of languages are we talking about? So give real examples of places or of cultures where you think that this might be relevant, and even use it in your own examples, because notice that some of the examples were about languages as a whole, and some were about languages that we even use these days, national languages such as German, and so on. And I think it would have been better to focus much more on the languages that can be relevant. So it can be Native American languages, it can be dying Jewish languages such as Yiddish or Ladino. Hebrew was mentioned, and it was a dying language that was resurrected. Gaelic is considered a somewhat dead language that the Irish government is now trying to implement much more in schools. So I think then that contextualizing could have helped to also ground the logic into something that is a bit more plausible. And the last thing that I would say is, I guess, try and recognize more the sacrifice that you are making on your side. So sometimes, and it wasn't that major to determining things in the debate, but sometimes I heard speakers not fully acknowledging the fact that they do sacrifice something on their side. So I think governments do need to acknowledge to an extent that in their world, it's not as easy to learn from your grandmother or from your mother the language, and it's probably going to die over the years. And I think it's fair because you want to prioritize other things. On the side of opposition, you do want to recognize that there is an element of mutual exclusivity that doesn't mean that you can't be bilingual, but it probably means that you're not as fluent, that you're not as good in using the other languages, but you think that it's okay because you have other reasons to believe that. So I think then acknowledging more realistically the fact that you are sacrificing something for a greater something would help you, because that way you are not disengaging from what the other side says, but also you're able to reinforce everything that you say because you are making it more a matter of a comparative and not simply denying a reality in which you're talking about. So that's in terms of the general comments. Eventually, the rankings that I saw in this debate are the following. So this is eventually a closing half debate in which narrowly the first place goes to the closing government, then the second goes to the closing opposition, the third goes to the opening government, and the fourth goes to the opening opposition. So let me explain then the rationale, and we'll start from the bottom to the top. So we'll start from the top half, and here, opening opposition versus the opening government. Opening opposition, the reason you are below your opening government is that you bring a lot of unique characteristics of languages. However, notice that you don't show why we will definitely lose out on having all of those advantages, considering the counter mechanism that is proposed by the opening government, which is documentation. And you never show enough why all of the values that can be derived from a language would be that lost and that damned, even if we have documentation of the language. Your answer to that is that you say, well, documentation also carries resources, but that doesn't answer the idea that we can still get the benefits out of documenting. And you say, well, a language is constantly evolving. However, here, you're not being specific to dying languages, and you don't explain why dying languages are constantly evolving to the point where they are analogous to Shakespeare and Twitter, and then why this is something that wouldn't be enough when it comes to that. Also, you then don't answer the point where the opening government says that it does have reasons that are not only resources. So they do have a reason of resources, which is not extremely specific. And you are correct in pointing out that saying that this taking resources is not enough to show that this is bad, because some things take up resources but are deemed important enough. However, opening government does have reasons. They have the first reason in which they say people would be forced to learn this. So they assert a bit, but I think that at this point it's enough that the fact that a language is dying necessarily means that people don't want to use that language, don't like this language. Therefore, preserving the language would be a form of forcing them into the language, which is something wrong that we shouldn't do. Also, they say that language doesn't help you in life because you would rather have other languages and other advantages and not learn that. I don't think it's very well analyzed, but I do think that as opening opposition, you had a burden to refer to that and to explain why you don't find this to be an imposition, why people actually want this and why you think that this is fair, but also why you think that this is so helpful that we need to do this and not only document the language. And I think here, the moment you fail to do that, then opening government at least shows me enough reason as to why government shouldn't be the agent of creating the change. And then while there might be certain advantages that you show, the people don't want those advantages, therefore we shouldn't adopt the motion. And that is why the opening government is above you. Then when comparing the opening government to the closing opposition. So here there is a direct clash between the two teams on the question of, can we believe that people want or don't want to learn the dying languages, and therefore are we imposing it on them or are we allowing them to use the language? And here I think that closing opposition shows in a better analyzed way why we have reasons to believe that at least in certain cases there isn't an imposition by the government, but on the contrary, the government is the agent that has prevented the use of the language, and therefore the government has a responsibility of bringing that language back, and therefore this is not something that we are imposing on people, but this is something that we give the people that they themselves want. And I think that here this clash is settled well by the closing opposition. Then there is the question of, okay, so what helps me more in life? And should I use my language of origin or the main language of the state? To which here, I think closing opposition tries at least to make a prioritization of explaining that the culture might be more important to me and that I might want it more. In a second, we will see that it's not enough when compared to the closing government, but when compared to the opening government, I think that at least this attempt of showing then what the people want, and when we compare what helps me more, then I think you already do that comparative. And also you add to that, which I think is very important, the fact that we can still have the main language, meaning that I can have two languages, I can speak them both, and then I get both the cultural value and I get the fact that I speak the main language of the country, which I think once again answers enough what we hear from the opening government. Notice, however, that I don't think you fully answer the idea about the documentation, and why it's not necessarily enough. So I think that the clash about what people want is irrespective of that. So I think that the will of the people is not something that necessarily requires you to talk about documentation or not, since we can all assume that documentation is not a matter of how I can use the language, but simply of can we learn from the language. But I think there could be more room for that. However, I do think that settling those two main questions when compared to the opening government definitely puts you above them on those aspects. So that's on the long diagonal. Then in the closing half of the debate. So when we compare the closing government and the closing opposition, the main claim that comes from the closing government is that there is an element of mutual exclusivity between the dying language and the lingua franca of the place that we're talking about. And here I think that they refine their case not with simply saying you would not know English or German, but they have more of a nuance to that, in which they say there is a cost to then learning the lingua franca, and it makes it much harder, and that there are nuances in a language that you know as your mother tongue that can't be transferred if indeed you don't learn in that language as your primary language in school. And then I do believe that at least there is a difference. So here, while closing opposition would later on tell me, well, I can learn both languages, I don't think it answers fully the point coming from the closing government. So I think I can then at this point realize that, well, I can speak both languages, but it doesn't answer the fact that I would not speak both languages at the same level and with the same ability to control the language and then gain all of the benefits that I have. So that point still stands. But then there remains the question of, between the two teams, do I want the lingua franca more, or do I think that there is more value to having your own culture and your own language? And here notice that this question is not exactly weighed and answered between the two teams. So closing government simply says there is a lot of value to it and gives a lot of impacts that derive from that. And the closing government asserts a bit that says, okay, if you would ask me, I would prefer to have my own culture. However, you don't give an analytical explanation of why there is a preference towards that if it is somewhat on the expense of having the main language, and then why would I prefer the culture and not the material benefits that I can have, such as getting a job and integrating into society and so on. And then since there is not enough of that prioritization and explanation of why we care more about our culture, even if people want it, I am inclined to go with the closing government that then shows me more benefits, and I do get that there is a difference in terms of people's life and how they can lead them. So that's why they are above you. Questions about the rationale? Okay. So do we have time for a bit of personal feedback? Because I can give you like quick points. Okay, cool. So Prime Minister. So on a bit of a technical